16, I probably took my first flying lesson. I soloed at 17. It's just always been my dream. Fortunate enough to live my dream, for sure. The fear goes away because when you're in there in the cockpit, it's like home. You're used to the sounds and everything. I became a graduate research assistant. I had some pretty good mentors then because they grabbed me by the throat and said, don't throw this away. And I'm glad I didn't, because it really helped me in my career. When you get into the crazy stuff, when they make us do these recoveries from 65-degree banks and all that other stuff, you have to basically turn the motion off because you'll either make yourself sick or damage the simulator because it can't give you G's, but you swear you're accelerating or decelerating in that simulator.
Hello and welcome to the Career Journey Podcast, No Wrong Choices. I'm Larry Samuels, and I'll soon be joined by Tushar Saxena and Larry Shea. Our guest today is Captain Ken Petschauer of JetBlue Airways. Before we bring him in, please be sure to like, follow, and subscribe to the show wherever you're listening. Your support enables us to keep bringing these great stories to life. Now let's get started. Now joining No Wrong Choices is Captain Ken Petschauer of JetBlue Airways. Ken is a pilot who's been in the air for more than 30 years and logged more than 16,000 flight hours. I can't begin to imagine how many miles that is. And interestingly, he is also a ski patroller for the National Ski Patrol. Ken, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks, guys. Glad to be here. Been looking forward to it.
As we look at you...
You say that now.
Yeah, right.
I feel like I need to ask this question going in. Are you actually talking to us from an airplane hangar?
I actually am talking to you from my hangar right behind my house.
The credibility is off the charts.
Yeah.
So, Ken, we like to set up our conversations by giving our guests the opportunity to tell us who they are and what they do. I can run through a list, but it is nothing more than a list of bullet points. You know you better than anybody else, so please set the stage for us. Who is Captain Ken Petschauer, and what do you do?
So I guess first, the personal stuff. I'm married to a beautiful wife for 12 years. Her name's Alicia. She's very patient and amazing. You can imagine. And we have probably the best beagle hound ever created. He's 8 years old, and actually he's 2, but they say that's a good thing.
That is a good thing.
He's pretty neat. We're fortunate. We live a great lifestyle, very active. I'm always outside. I don't actually sit still very well, which is kind of weird because my job kind of requires that. But for some reason, that's different. So it always seems like we're out doing something. I'm always running or skiing in the winter or hiking. I've been lucky to have great adventures in my life. I've done long distance sailboat racing and small boats and adventure racing and helicopter skiing and all kinds of stuff. So always looking for another challenge or something that's new or different, kind of like this. And I'm also like the computer geek around here. It seems like I'm forever going to somebody's house to fix their Wi-Fi or build them a computer or fix something for them. I'm always tinkering with gadgets and electronics and 3D printing and things like that. We also really like, new adventures. So we'll take the plane to towns and cities that we haven't been to before. My wife's big into history, so we like to go to the historic towns and do stuff like that. And we also spend a lot of time up in North Carolina. That's where we do most of the skiing. I have a little cabin up there in the mountains. So that's pretty much what we do without getting too detailed.
Excellent.
And then professionally?
I am a pilot for JetBlue. I've been with them now for 22 years and before that I was with TWA. I don't know if you guys remember that airline.
Sure.
Of course. What was that movie with the guy who was the great scam artist who...
Catch Me If You Can.
Catch Me If You Can, right.
Oh, I got all kinds of history about that because that building, the all-wing building that the JetBlue hangar is behind,
Yep.
I worked out of that building when I first got hired.
Oh, wow.
So I got to fly some of the Jurassic jets, we call them, the 727s and the DC-9s and stuff. So I did that for a while. So I have like 28 years being an airline pilot and 38 years pretty much flying airplanes.
Very cool.
It bleeds into my personal life too, because we do like dog rescues in our airplane and things like that. It's just part of our life.
Hey, Ken, so good to meet you. This is Larry Shea. I get the fun part, bringing you back to the beginning and the dream. Let's dig into it. Do you remember the first time you were in a plane? And
Oh God, absolutely.
did that become the dream? Like at that moment, you're like, this is the best thing ever. This is what I'm going to do for the rest of my life.
So my dad was a pilot,
Okay.
but he had been out of actually flying airplanes for many years before I was born. He has a very unique story where he came over from Europe and then went back and came back. And so he was out of flying when I was born, and he was in the travel business. But for some reason, and he didn't talk about it that much. We would always talk about it once in a while, but at about 8 years old, I just always loved airplanes. If he had to go to the airport to drop off tickets or something, I'd always want to go to smell the jet fuel and look at the airplanes at Kennedy or LaGuardia. I always liked Kennedy better because I had the bigger airplanes and the foreign carriers. So just always wanted to do it. And then when he saw that I was getting this interest, then I was fortunate, he supported me. And I started flying like as soon as I was able. Yeah. I think at 16, I probably took my first flying lesson. I soloed at 17. It's just always been my dream. Yeah. Fortunate enough to live my dream for sure.
So what was that first plane? And by the way, this is a two-star speaking there, Ken. What was that first plane that you ever got your hands on that you were able to begin your flying lessons in?
So, yeah, the first time I ever was in a small plane, it was years. I was probably only 12 or so. My uncle actually took us up in a plane for like a discovery flight. They just put us all in a plane and we flew around. And at that point already, I was very much into airplanes. And I was running a flight simulator on the old Apple IIe computer, every 5 seconds it would kind of turn a little bit, and had been studying the books from my dad's old books and the new books and learning about everything. So the pilot was like, oh my God, you know about all these things already. And I'm like, oh yeah, this is what I want to do. But the first real, like when I first started taking flying lessons was, right at about 17 when I started actually taking lessons. And that airplane, I'll never forget it. It was a Cherokee 140, a Piper Cherokee 140. And I can still remember what it looks like. I remember the N number on it. It was 7597 Romeo. I even tried to find it.
Oh,
because
wow.
there are people who have, found the airplane they sold it and actually bought it. And I was thinking about doing that or something like that, but it's gone. It's, I don't know what happened to it, but it's no longer registered. So.
All right. So I can only imagine that obviously when you're taking lessons at 16, you don't even have your driver's license yet.
Correct.
So what was it like, or what was that feeling like when, you're going to school, you're growing up and you're telling your friends, yeah, I'm going to go up and solo in a plane, and they're looking at you cross-eyed like you can't even drive a car, but people are putting you behind the wheel of a plane.
That was, unique. I grew up in New York City, right? So you couldn't even drive till I think you couldn't get your license till you were 19, and you didn't start driving at like 15 or 16 even. I think at 18 I could do it because I went to I did it in high school, so I did driver's ed, so I could get it at the license at 18. But yeah, when I first started flying, my brother or my dad would drive me out to Long Island. I'd get in the airplane, once I had a few hours and had soloed and was flying by myself. I'd fly the airplane myself over to Connecticut and back. At 17, and then they'd have to wait because I couldn't drive the car.
All right. I've also got to ask you, did you ever give flying lessons when you were still not allowed to drive at that point?
No.
Because I have an odd story. On my 45th birthday, I went to get flying lessons for the first time. I said, I'm going to try something I've never tried before. Want to fly a plane. We flew a Cessna. But the kid, and I mean kid in a very literal sense, did not have his driver's license and is teaching me how to fly a plane. I want to know if this is if I am unique or if this is kind of across the industry. And if it is, that's frightening.
No, you have to be, it would take longer to get your CFI. The CFI, the Certified Flight Instructor certificate,
Right.
It's one of the hardest ones to get. It's way down the road. You have a bunch of time before you become a CFI. So I doubt he was that young. I don't know how old. He might not have a driver's license and could have been, whatever age.
Well, that's even worse to say. If he was of age to get a license and had it suspended, but he's flying around, that's worse.
Well, that could be.
I want to get into
That's a good story.
I want to get into the process of what it takes to get your license. Just before we do that, do you ever have any trouble with heights in general? Because I'm afraid of heights. When I'm in an airplane, I'm like, oh boy, I'm like the white knuckler.
Yeah. So it's not about heights too, because I don't like heights either. Pilots and ladders are not a good mix, okay? Because we tend to fall off them.
God.
It's just ironic how many stories you hear about, oh, I was trimming my trees or I was cleaning out my gutters, and, and then the guy's off for 6 weeks or 6 months and all he fixes his back. But I don't like heights either if I did a lot of sailboat racing and they would send me up the mast. Okay. When you're up the mast of a sailboat and it's tipping on a 44-foot boat, you can imagine how high the mast is. That thing is swaying back and forth. Even though I'm strapped in, I did not like that as far as height. So when you're flying, for some reason, it's not the same. It may be for other people, but that's not like if I'm standing on the edge of a building, I'd be like, oh God, but in the plane, I'd never feel that. And I think that's the same for a lot of people, but I'm not sure. I'm sure some other people have acrophobia in every phase.
I want to get to the journey, but before we do that, I have to ask this question. When you talk about climbing up a mast, so were you always like the adventurous kid? You're taking flying lessons, you're on a boat, you're climbing a mast. Who were you as a kid? Were you always doing stuff like that?
It's funny. I guess inside I always was. And I guess, to me, flying is just all I've ever known and all I've ever done. So to me, to do it, it wasn't like he asked earlier about, what did you tell your friends in high school when you'd go? Well, my friends just knew I kind of did it. And I didn't really talk it up much. The parents like, don't brag about it. You know what I mean? Don't.
Yeah.
So that's just what I did. Everybody I knew, I kind of did it. So I guess that in itself is very adventurous. To me, it wasn't. That's all I wanted to do. It's all I was going to do. And it didn't seem adventurous. And as I got older, then I started doing these other crazy things like these long distance races and working on sailboats and crossing the Gulf and everything in a 40-foot boat and, being sent up the mast because I was the light guy. They don't want to crank the heavy guy. The BG, they call him, the big guy, and they didn't want to crank him up.
So let's focus the journey a little bit. You're young, you're flying. Was the vision at the age of 16 or 17 to learn how to fly, or was it to become a pilot and for that to be your career going forward?
It was always to be a pilot.
Okay.
Just always wanted to be a pilot, and specifically an airline pilot. Military would always be fun. Hey, you could do a military career, fly, a fighter jet, who didn't want to do that as a kid, and then go on to a military career. Just as my career progressed, the timing of it, there were no flying slots. After Vietnam, the government downsized things. There were very few flying spots. So like a military career in aviation wasn't as available, if that makes sense.
What kind of schooling does that require? In high school, are you able to kind of build that skill set? Obviously, you're doing your own private lessons at that point, but like if you're going to get a degree in, I guess, in aviation, if that's what you did, or avionics for that sense, what does that schooling look like?
Back when I was going to go through and get hired, by the time I would be of age and have the experience to get hired, you needed a 4-year degree. And it could be in anything. It didn't have to be in aviation.
That was going to be my next question. So you could have a degree in English and still become a pilot.
Correct. Yeah, but you had to have some 4-year degree. Now, that's even changed because of supply and demand. But the path I decided to take, because I knew it was going to be a very competitive environment by the time I would be ready. And I was always just interested in aeronautics, aviation itself. I went to Embry-Riddle Aeronautical University, which is, they call it the Harvard of the skies or whatever. But that was like the school to go to. There's several other ones. Purdue has an excellent, aviation program, among others. But that was one of the schools to go to if you wanted to be an airline pilot. And that would give you the advantage that when you do go to get hired, you can show, hey, listen, my whole life's been dedicated to this. So if it's you compared to someone else, they're going to go, well, this guy's dedicated his whole life in education to this specific goal. Hopefully we would rather hire him.
So that's the schooling aspect, the 4-year degree part of it. I didn't know that. That's fascinating. And again, you said supply and demand. It doesn't really happen today. What is the actual process, though, to get the pilot's license? Is it a certain amount of hours? Obviously, taking off and landing are critical. What is the process like? Lead us through that a little bit.
There are several levels of licenses that you can get. There's like the lowest one right now, they have what they call like a sport pilot license. But really, if you're going to go into flying as a career or even private, they call it the first level of certificate. It's called a private pilot certificate. And that has its own specific value of flight hours that you're required to have at a minimum most people take a little bit more because if you fly every day, you can do it maybe in the minimum. If you fly once a week, you do lose some skills over the week that you haven't done it or the timing you have to do it. So, but basically, there's a certain amount of time of, flying the airplane, doing work in the pattern, takeoffs and landings and the stalls and steep turns and all these other maneuvers you have to be proficient at. And then you have to do what they call cross countries. So you actually have to go and fly to different airports that are a certain distance away all by yourself to prove that you can do it. And you do several of those, of course, at different distances. And then, you get back with your instructor, you practice up your maneuvers, and then you can take your check ride. But there's a specific minimum number of hours, and that's changed a little bit too. And if you go through a program, though, like Embry-Riddle or some of these other flight schools, they have very specific programs where you're going to start at the private pilot level, let's say, and progress all the way through up to like your certified flight instructor rating. Since it's a very, very structured school, they have some waivers that you can actually have a little bit less flight time because it's very structured, as opposed to just going down to Joe's flight school on the corner and taking lessons from that kind of person. So there are several levels. You have to first get your private pilot, and then the instrument rating, and then a commercial pilot, and then eventually probably a flight instructor. And eventually, once you get your 1,500 hours and fly for an airline, you have to be what they call an ATP, or an airline transport pilot.
Okay, so set the levels aside for a second and answer this question for me. True or false? Ultimately, flying a plane isn't much harder than driving a car once you've had all that proper training.
Correct.
Really?
Yeah.
Wow.
Shocking answer.
Flying is not, it's not rocket science. It's a skill.
Well, it sort of is,
right?
isn't it? It's
Yeah, well,
It seems like it.
when you add all that stuff in, I also did mention in all of these too, there's lots of ground school with all of this too. The ground school books are enormous, and there's lots involved with that. And typically, you try to get your written tests done before the practical test, or you have to before you take the practical test to get your license. But there's a lot to it, and depending on what level you're in, you don't have to learn it at all those levels. Flying itself isn't difficult. It's just the consequences for mistakes are much greater.
yes.
Of
The
course.
takeoff and the landing, those are the hard parts. The staying in the air, not that hard.
Yeah, right. Everybody thinks that, say landing's the hardest or whatever. It can be. It just makes it so challenging because it's different every time. You can't just go, okay, do this, hold this for 3 seconds, pull back this much, hold this for 3 seconds, and it works because the atmosphere is constantly changing. It's never exactly the same. I tell people, go take your car, put 2 cones out, and parallel park it 20 times and be 1 inch from the curb or 3 inches from the curb or 6 inches, and do that 20 times and see how much times you get exactly right. And then add, ice or something,
Can you tell us about the first time you landed an airplane? How old were you, and what were those emotions?
Oh man, well, I was 17 years old, and you kind of know that solo is coming. The instructor's preparing you for it. We took off out of Farmingdale. That's where I was doing my lessons from, and flew over to Bridgeport, Connecticut. And I did like 2 landings, and he said, pull over there on that ramp. And he just got out. And I was like, oh.
Wow.
Yeah, I remember it vividly. I remember what I was wearing. I remember the runway. I remember all of it because it's an amazing feeling and accomplishment. And the fear goes away because when you're in there in the cockpit, it's like home. You're used to the sounds and everything. The funny thing everybody tells about their first solo is the instructor gets out and says, hey, just so you know, you're going to be in this airplane alone for the first time. My 180 pounds is not going to be in it. So on takeoff, it's going to climb much better than you're used to, and stuff like that, right? And you're like, oh, geez, give me something else to think about.
After you got out of your aviation school, what was that first move for you career-wise after that?
So it was a little different for me than some maybe. I graduated with my 4-year degree, and it was a terrible time.
Where were you? What was your rank in your class?
I don't really know, honestly, how that all works.
I mean, famously, the late Senator John McCain was, I think, last in his class at the Naval Academy. It turned out it was a terrific flyer as well.
Absolutely, yeah. And it's like they said, what do they call the guy who graduates last from medical school? Doctor. Right? So,
Right.
I like that.
But it just my luck. It was a terrible time. The industry, they had hundreds of pilots, if not thousands of pilots on furlough. The economy was bad. Nobody was hiring. The supply and demand part of it was terrible. There were pilots all over the place, and you couldn't even really find like flight instructor jobs, or which now are a dime a dozen, or anything. I mean, it was just like very little flying. So it was very discouraging. I was fortunate. I was using my computer geekery skills, and I was working at the university in their airway science simulation laboratory, working on flight simulators, and I had got put in charge of a project to run their air traffic control training simulator. And when I went to leave, they're like, "You can't leave. You run this whole thing." And I was like, "Well, no, I'm going to go. I got to go find a flying job. I'm a pilot." And they were like, "No, you can't go." And they actually offered me a free master's degree
Oh, wow.
to stay. So I became a graduate research assistant for them. And I had some pretty good mentors then, because they grabbed me by the throat and said, "Don't throw this away. You'll fly on the side. You continue flying. A lot of people around here will get you some flight instructor hours, but don't throw this away." And I'm glad I didn't, because it really helped me in my career. So I stayed and did a master's degree about a year and a half from there. So got that done. And then things started looking a little bit better. So my first job was basically flight instructing, which is pretty much typical. I got a flight instructor job in Orlando, and I was also doing traffic reports. So I was flying with radio personalities with us in the airplane, and we were transmitting live from the airplane. And that was a whole hoot. I've got all kinds of stories about that.
What was the station, or was it TV?
It was like 4 or 5 stations in Orlando. And it was funny
When they
because
still had 4 or 5 stations.
yeah, right, exactly. And it was weird because, I was never into the entertainment industry or whatever, but I'd go check out the plane, have to get the copy for them to read all the, off the fax machine of all their, advertisements I had to read. And the guy, it was either one reporter or 2 reporters. They had 2 airplanes that go up at the same time, Sky 1 and Sky 2. And they were the traffic twins on one station. And on the other station, they each had their own personalities. They were different people. So it was just pretty unique. One guy was this, none this. And on that station, they were the traffic twins. It was pretty interesting.
So is this the first instance where somebody is actually paying you to fly an airplane?
Yes. Flight instructing and flying the traffic report. So my first real flying job.
You talk about living the dream. That's the dream right there, right?
And how old are you at this point?
Probably 22.
That's nice. Right there. That's nice.
Yeah. I mean, I graduated college at 21. So I was probably 22 or 23 because I started this right as I was finishing my master's degree.
Okay. This is as good a place to ask this as any. Favorite airplane to fly and why?
757, no doubt.
Okay. Why?
Yeah. I flew it for TWA. It's just sexy. Flew amazing. It was before the over-automated, what I call jets that we have today. It still had like analog gauges, yet enough computers in it, like with a flight management system, with a moving map and stuff like that, which was relatively new at the time. A great mixture of that, and it was just incredibly powerful. You could go in and out of just about any field, never have to worry about temperature, heat, weight, anything like that. It was just a perfect balance. It was a great Boeing airplane.
Very cool. So you talked about the different levels of license that you can get and so forth. How transferable is it from this plane to that plane to that plane? I assume you have to be certified for a specific aircraft. Like, how much does the knowledge transfer from one plane to another, essentially?
Quite honestly, a lot of the knowledge transfers. You can, especially with smaller airplanes, like I have a single engine airplane. If you have a twin engine airplane, it's a little different. You have to have a different rating. Of course, I have that rating. And with small airplanes, it's typically you can fly it. The biggest restrictions are what the insurance company will allow you to do, right? But the regulation wise, in order to fly from like an Airbus, which I'm flying now, or go fly to 787, you need what they call a type rating. So if it weighs more than 12,500 pounds, which all of those way over that, you need what they call a type rating. So typically how that works is if I'm in an airline that has multiple different fleets of airplanes and I want to go fly the other airplane, I want to bid to fly in the bigger airplane or the smaller airplane or whatever, they just train you on it. And you do it in their simulators and you get a type rating in that airplane. And now you're qualified on that airplane. You can't switch. Like I can't go fly, even if you were previously on that airplane, you can't just switch fleets. You're only certified on one fleet. They changed that years ago. There was a time where you could do multiple, but it's just gotten so complicated with all the electronics and computers and systems that that's just not possible anymore.
How real is the simulation experience?
It is the fidelity is unbelievable. It's so accurate as we're taxiing. I can feel the turtles, we call them. In the runway lights in the center line, they'll have like a taxi, they're green and they look like a turtle. So we call them killer turtles. Yeah, I'm killing turtles. As you go over the bump, 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 you feel that as you're taxiing. If you're at the gate in the simulator and it's cold and windy, you feel the simulator actually moving with the wind.
Oh, wow.
You can see cars on the road. You can see that they have headlights on. You can see everything. Buildings have the names of whatever businesses are there. I mean, it's just, the fidelity is incredible. And the motion also. When you get into the crazy stuff, when they make us do these recoveries from 65-degree banks and all that other stuff, you have to basically turn the motion off because you'll either make yourself sick or damage the simulator because it can't give you G's, but you swear you're accelerating or decelerating in that simulator. And if you ever watch one from the outside, it's incredible how much they move to simulate the stopping. Like when you land and you throw the reverse on and slam on the brakes and you're in your shoulder harnesses. And the problem is it can't really give you that release of it again.
Yeah.
You can't simulate that. The visuals actually go dark before they reposition you because it'll make you instantly sick.
Wow.
Yeah.
I'm amazing. What is the Captain Kirk thing? The Kobayashi Maru that he had
Kobayashi Maru.
So for those who do not follow Star Trek, as Captain Kirk was learning, they threw like these crazy crises at him that he had to solve in order to get approved. And that's what I'm imagining with you. Like, as you're going through these different simulations, are crazy scenarios getting thrown at you that you need to handle and get through in order to get certified and approved?
There's nothing crazy. They don't want to negative train you either, right? You don't want to be up there cowboying it and stuff like that. We have very specific procedures for very specific incidences. So you do get a lot of failures, but that's the whole idea. And every time you go back to training. When I used to train, I was a check pilot for the airline. And when I was a fleet captain, I was actually training check pilots. So sometimes we would give those guys a little bit more than we would give someone else just to build confidence. And I mean, you can do all kinds of stuff, failing landing gear and engines falling off. But we do get quite a bit. I just went through my recurrent training and you get engine fires and hydraulic failures and all kinds of things like that, because that's what we need to deal with. That's really why we're there, right?
Oh, yeah.
So let's talk a little bit now. Let's get back on the career path a little bit. So you've been flying around. You've been dabbing into, you're a local celebrity, flying TV and radio personalities around. What would you say is your first real job from that? I mean, obviously that's a real gig, but I'm saying like your first, let's say, real job after that.
When you get your flight time, right? Oh, you get my flight time. You have to have so many hours. Nowadays, it's like 1,500 hours to get on with the airlines. And you need a lot of what they call multi-time, right? So 2-engine time, they want that. So you need 1,500 hours basically to get hired in an airline. There are some waivers if you went through like one of those Embry-Riddle schools and a specific, and that makes sense. Or sometimes the military guys, they get a break because they don't get to fly as much, but they're also in a very structured program. It's so much about safety and threat and error management and systems and meteorology and everything else that goes along with it, that the flying is actually a smaller portion of the full education in aviation.
Yeah, I mean, like that portion of it. But like I said, your first like big gig
First big gig, yeah. This business is very small, and I had a friend who was a retired former TWA pilot who had run a corporate flight department out in San Jose, California. So I'm in Orlando, and it was, hey, if you come out here, I can get you some time. And they had a Cheyenne 3, which is a turboprop, awesome airplane. And they also flew another twin, and they're going to start up like a charter operation, and they need a first officer. And with my qualifications, I would actually qualify to be the first officer on that airplane for them. I said, hey, we're going to start this operation up. If you get out here, there's no guarantee of a job or how much money you're going to make, but I can get you to twin time and to multi-time and some turbine time also, because we also fly Part 91 a lot, and we'll get you trained. And I was like, holy cow! I jumped in the car, you all moved cross country.
You didn't hop on a plane?
Yeah, right, exactly, yeah. I had no clue where I was going. I didn't know what exit to get off when I was there. It was before Google Maps and all that stuff. It turned out to be great. It was, started real slow. I got another flight instructor job out there also to supplement income. And I started doing that, and that started to work out pretty well. And then as I was doing well for those guys, again, it's a small business. Other guys out there in the San Jose area, a lot of little charters and stuff wanted pilots that they could train. And I got phone calls from him going, hey, if you got time, can you come and fly with me? And I flew with a bunch of other guys in turboprops and stuff like that to build all my flight time so I could get hired with TWA.
Let's talk about moving to TWA. How do you get that gig specifically? And then how big of a learning curve is it? How different is it to work for a larger airline compared to a smaller company that's a charter or a flight school or something of that nature? What was the learning curve? How different was it?
Oh, yeah. I mean, it was tectonically different. When they hire pilots, it's a seniority-based system. And when they hire you, they still had the 727 and the L1011 and the 747, which all had flight engineers. I don't know if you guys remember, that was a third pilot up there. And you're a pilot and you're hired as a pilot, but you don't have the seniority to hold that yet. So you'd be a flight engineer. And this is where my education was just, I made the right decision, because even though I didn't have the amount of flight time that their average pilot that they were hiring had, because the hiring floodgates had opened. I got hired in February of 96. The hiring floodgates all of a sudden opened again in mid to late 95. So in 96, they still had a lot of pilots that they could hire that had a lot of experience. I met their minimum requirements, but I wasn't what you would call normally would be competitive just with flight time. But my background was unique and different. And because I had a bunch of this turbine time now of my time, because I was flying with this guy, and my educational background. So when I was sitting in the interview, the first question she asked me is you've got, a master's degree, because it wasn't common to have an aeronautics master's degree,
Right.
Back then. And especially my young age, she was at 22 or 24, whatever I was. And you've got this kind of flight time, which is lower than what we normally see. We meet our minimums, but you're sitting here because you're different. Tell me about that, because in my resume and stuff, I showed how I had gotten this, worked on these projects. So that helped me get hired. So I was very different. I also was working on the flight simulator. They actually gave me my flight test in, and I was showing the guy giving me my flight test for my interview how it worked.
Oh, that's great.
It had what they call dynamic control loading. That would feel like you're flying, and he couldn't get it working. I'm like, oh, here, well, go in here. And he's like, how do you know that? I said, I helped build that. And he's like,
that's great.
Okay, then. And also the guy I was flying for was a former TWA pilot. So I knew all their call outs, all their procedures. So it went well. And then getting hired with that was very different, because I had never been a flight engineer before. But again, going through every riddle, I had taken a class on being a flight engineer in the 727.
Jeez.
The education choice was the right choice. So it was not that big of a deal, but it was huge and a big advantage, because as opposed to sitting in a pilot seat and all of a sudden going 8 miles a minute, you got to spend a little bit of time in the engineer seat and getting used to the airline environment and how it worked. So it made it a lot easier when I transitioned to first officer.
And what does that mean? You're in the flight engineer seat. I'm thinking about the steps. So you're a flight engineer, then you're a co-pilot, I imagine,
Correct,
and then you're the pilot. So describe the roles in a cockpit.
The flight engineer basically ran all the systems. So there were no real computers running everything. You were responsible for balancing the fuel and all the electricity, and it was quite complicated. You had 3 or 4 generators. You had 6, 8, 10 fuel tanks. You had to pump the fuel back and forth. I mean, it was very, very complicated. That's why you needed a whole separate person just to manage the systems of the airplane. Even back in the DC-9 days, when they got rid of flight engineers, a lot of that is automated, even though it's not really computerized. It was relays and stuff like that would take care of a lot of those systems. So nowadays You have the pilot flying and the pilot monitoring. You got the captain who's ultimately in charge, and then the first officer who's second in command. And basically we swap roles. Like captain's always the captain, but we swap flying roles. So on one leg, I'll be the pilot flying and he's the pilot monitoring. And on the next leg, we switch and they do the landing. Unless it's really bad weather, or an inexperienced first officer, or certain weather conditions where they require the captain to land.
All right, so I want to talk a little bit about the culture aspect of, because I picture you like when you're doing essentially like a flight school or charter, you essentially are showing up in like jeans and a bowling shirt.
That's right.
But obviously, when you're working in a corporate environment, the culture has to be considerably different. The instrumentation, as you mentioned, is different. So what's that like when you're entering that type of a more structured environment, like a TWA, a JetBlue, etc.?
It's actually easier because everything is so spelled out exactly how you do everything. The manuals are large, the procedures are detailed, and there's a procedure for everything. So it's almost easier than when you're with a flight department that doesn't have quite the rigid standards of the airline, FAR Part 121, we call it. That's the regulations that underneath standards. So it doesn't mean that they're unsafe or anything. It's just you could be flying with different guys that maybe do things a little bit different here, or, checklist use, stuff like that. When you fly for the airline, everything is specific to that airline. It's actually easier because you know exactly what to study, exactly what's expected of you, and exactly what the other guy is going to do.
And when you say you have a checklist, I mean, do you have a literal clipboard? You got to mark stuff off?
Absolutely, yeah. So you don't mark stuff up, but it's a card. It's a checklist.
Right.
This checklist, that checklist. So when you're trained to come into the airplane to get it ready to fly, there's two things. You have like what they call a flow. So I sit in my seat and then I take a flow with my hand. I go up and down every switch and every panel to make sure everything's exactly where I want it. And then we check it with a checklist to make sure all the critical items have been accomplished.
You don't think about that part of it when you're a passenger on an airplane that,
I will now.
You do now,
Yeah.
right? Like that somebody's been there for an hour and a half running through every single button and switch, and they're going to be there. And you're going to be there an hour afterwards, right? Doing your post-flight stuff, correct?
Yeah, post-flight's pretty quick. I mean, post-flight, we're off. I mean, we can be off before some of the passengers are, depending on how many people are on the plane.
Right.
Post-flight is not all that much, especially if another crew is coming in. If they're already waiting in the jetway or anything, we shut the engines down. We do our securing checklist. And, I like to say goodbye to the passengers. I kind of live the airline pilot life, But if we have to get to the hotel because we need rest or something like that, we can leave it. It's powered up and it's fine. We are really careful to make sure that if they had done some maintenance, that everything is exactly where it needs to be before we go. And the checklist is like the final backstop. The airplane warns you too. It's got warning systems like your car, but the checklist is the final backstop.
Very cool. So since we're on this part, talk about the lifestyle. Talk about living in a hotel room. Talk about traveling all the time, what your days off are like. Do you get 4 in a row because you've been flying for 5 in a row? How does it work? Obviously, it's different with each airline, but what's the general lifestyle of a pilot?
You'd be surprised. It's very similar across all the major airlines. It's all unionized, and we all have contracts that we know that we have the same basic contracts, right? There's just some minor differences in it. And what's so nice is it's very flexible in most airlines. And if you live close to base like I do, I just drive an hour to the airport, it makes it a different life. It's much easier if you live in base and don't what they call commute. The typical schedule for a line pilot like myself, meaning just flying a regular line of time, we call it, is somewhere between 15 to 17 days a month is what you work. And I typically fly 2 to 4 day trips. So we have all kinds of trips, 1-day trips, 2-day trips, 3-day trips, 4-day trips, 5-day trips. The guys that live really close to the airport, they like the turns, we call it, like a 1-day trip where you just go to the airport, fly to Kennedy and back. Or you maybe do 3 legs that day, like a triangle or something, because they're home every night. So you can actually live this lifestyle and actually do that. Now, you got to be pretty senior probably and live very close to the airport. I prefer, since I have to drive an hour each way, it's too much to do turns, to fly 3- and 4-day trips. Typically, you go out, fly 2 to 3 legs a day, lay over, do the same thing the next day and the same thing the next day for 3 or 4 days. We have very flexible schedules. We can trade with other guys, and you can swap trips, and you can do other things. It's pretty nice to be able to move my schedule around. Like when I'm doing the ski patrol stuff in the winter, I move all my flying to like the beginning of the month on 1 month, and then the end of the month on the next month. So I get 2 weeks off in between.
Oh, that's great.
Right. So it works out really well. Now, there are very strict rules, like you had mentioned. We can't fly over so many hours in a day, and that depends on what time of day you started. If you're flying into the WACL, the window of circadian low for your body, then you can't fly as many hours, and you need more hours rest in between flights. So it's very complicated, but we got computers to help us with that, to say, okay, yeah, this is a legal trip, that's not a legal trip. It's usually not a problem unless we run into delays and cancellations and all kinds of stuff, which is a large headache.
What is the maximum number of hours you're allowed to fly in a day?
Typically 9.
Okay.
Yeah, it could be 8. It just depends if you started like 2 a.m. or 3 a.m. It's typically 9 hours. And it's also based on how many legs you fly and at the time of day you showed. But it's typically about 9 hours. By the time I'm off duty, sometimes it could be 12 to 14 hours. It can be some pretty long days sometimes.
Wow.
But you get used to it, and you get used to living in hotels, you had asked me. It's just a lifestyle, and you make the best of it. And there are great times too. Like I can bring my wife on if I have a long layover in DC or something. Wow, we're going to go do some museums or something, right? Or we're down in the Caribbean at a nice resort, and you can bring family or friends and stuff like that with you. Beats working for a living.
That concludes part 1 of this great conversation with Captain Ken Petschauer. We'll pick things up right where we left off next week. Thank you again for joining us. If this episode made you think of somebody who could be a great guest, we'd love to hear from you. Please reach out to us through the contact page of our website, which can be found at NoWrongChoices.com. While you're there, check out the blog for a deeper look at our takeaways from each episode. You can also connect with us on social media. We're on LinkedIn, Instagram, Facebook, YouTube, and X. On behalf of Larry Shea, Tushar Saxena, and me, Larry Samuels, thank you again for listening.